All right, we are live. Brad, welcome to the podcast, man. So great to have you here tonight.
Great to be here, Scott. Thank you.
So we're talking about strategy and putting strategy first. So the first question out of gates, let's knock a home run, grand slam of this one. Why is strategy and putting strategy first going to help our leaders out there to get their organizations to hit peak performance? Because that's what we're about here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast.
Well, if you think about it, there's so many things that are important to successful leadership. But if you don't make the right bets and you don't make the right strategic, formulations at the beginning, when you start your business or when you revise it over time, it doesn't matter that you're an inspirational leader. It doesn't matter that you're compassionate. It doesn't matter that you are creative. You first have to build a winning strategy, or all those other things, which are also important, don't matter. And that's why strategy has to be first for a successful leader.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. So let's dive into it. So strategy can mean a lot to a lot of different people. So what, for you, from your standpoint, what is strategy in its essence?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you will find, Scott, that lots of people don't know really what strategy is. And I have a simple definition to make it, just easy to remember. Strategy is your plan to compete. Put it in a longer definition, a plan to compete to achieve your business goals. And whenever you create a plan, you're always competing. And that's key to my whole model of strategy first, is that whatever your strategy is, you have to build a winning strategy relative to the competition. And that's super important.
Yeah. Okay. So out of that, now there's got to be some different components, some different aspects and stuff like this. So let's dive in. So what would they be? How do we go about making that winning strategy when taking those things into consideration?
Yeah, that's sort of the core part of my strategy first model. So I'm glad to talk about it. So there's sort of three components to the strategy, stool, so to speak. The first and most important is customer value. Whatever you do to provide a value to your customer is usually the most important part of any strategy. The second is market potential. And that's sort of how much profit is out there in that market that you're in. And the third part of it is execution. Now, some people think executing on a strategy is separate. In other words, all the things you do to run your business day to day. But I don't see it that way. Because when you execute, you are competing. And remember, I define strategy as your plan to compete. And the way I put all these pieces together is I use Einstein's famous theory of relativity as sort of a mnemonic model. So instead of E equals MC squared, it's E times MC squared. E for execution, M for market potential, and C for customer value. And the C is squared because in most strategies, customer value is most important. But it's important to remember, just like Einstein's model, that it's all relative. The success of your strategy can be measured relative to the strategy of your competition.
So can we dive a little bit more into those a little bit deeper now? So
sure.
let's look at the execution part, seeing how you put it up front. I was going to go last to it, but now you got me interested in going up first to it. So let's dive into execution. So what does that look like, for the leaders out there in executing their strategy so that they don't, essentially mess it up and fail at it? So what should we be looking at? What different components or aspects where do they normally fail or falter? All these different things when it comes to executing on a strategy.
Well, we could talk about that for a while. So assuming that you've made the right bet, because if you make the wrong bet and execute on the wrong bet, it won't matter. But assume you make the right bet, then how do you execute well? Well, first it starts with having some objectives, because if you don't know where you're driving, then you're not going to get there. And that's sort of the first part. And then I like to recommend people have a set of principles for how they sort of execute on their business. They're going to be customer centric. They're going to, focus on customer support, or they're going to be innovative. There's lots of different sort of principles you can have as a business. And then I have what I call the next step, which is priorities. So whenever you are executing on a business strategy, you have lots of things you're doing, hundreds, if not thousands of things that you're doing. But there's a 3 or 4 or 5 at most that are the most important. When Steve Jobs built the iPhone, he had to get the user experience right. If you don't get the user experience right, the rest of it really wouldn't have mattered. So I always encourage, when you're executing, to define your most important priorities. And then that helps you do the rest of executing well, which is what I call ACT: align, communicate, curate, and track. Align is about making sure you have all the resources on the most important priorities. It's about making sure that you have the right people in the right place in the organization. It's about making sure you get the right expertise in your organization to execute well on your strategy, and so forth. When we talk the C in ACT, it's for communicate and curate. So I've been in normal situations, and I've been in abnormal situations, but in almost all business situations, you'd be shocked to know that most people don't know in a company what their company strategy is. In fact, there's been research that says only 14% of people in organizations actually can articulate what the company strategy is. So it's really important to communicate the strategy really well throughout the organization, so everybody knows how they are participating, and to curate a strategy and a culture. Let's just say curate a culture that is consistent with communicating that strategy. And finally, track to improve. You have to track how you're doing and make adjustments along the way. Some things are going to work and some things are not going to work. And many times strategy has to be adjusted because, the world is not static. And of course, there's many sort of, ways that people do this. OKRs is a way that people use to really track and see how successful they are. And you could use models like that if that really helps you. For those who don't know, OKRs stands for objectives and key results, probably something you've talked about on your podcast. So that's sort of the model for how to execute well. I could go into obviously a lot more detail, but that gives you a high level overview.
No, it's a great overview, and I kind of got like little offshoot questions on each aspect. But I want to go right back to the beginning, and you talked about the priorities and the importance of priority. And God, I don't know how many times I've either been in the situation or I've been helping people with the situation where they've been like, "Oh, this is a priority, and that's a priority, and this other thing is a priority, and that over there with the kitchen sink, that's a priority too." I'm like, for God's sakes, if everything's a priority, guess what? Nothing's a priority. Yeah. And really, what's your best advice along those lines for the leaders out there who are sitting there and they're kind of like looking at it? They understand, yes, I have to prioritize, but they're in that kind of analysis paralysis zone of prioritizing. Like, I don't know what actually is the priority because it's all important. What's your best advice for them to get out of that kind of loop?
It all goes back to what your strategy is, what bets you're making, and what your plan is to compete. So whatever your plan is to compete, you have to focus on the things that are going to give you the highest leverage to be successful with that plan relative to the competition. But I mean, you can take all sorts of examples every day. I'll take, let's say Yeti. I'm picking something out of the blue here. So Yeti makes a really, sort of rugged industrial strength cooler, and that's how they started their business. And they thought when they first started, maybe no one would spend $400 or $500 on a cooler that will keep things cold longer, and you could sit on it when you're fishing and stuff like that. Well, turns out that they did, and their first priority was, we got to make sure we build an absolutely indestructible rugged cooler, and they focused on the things that would help them achieve that. You talked about companies that we know better, like what Amazon's done with Amazon Web Services. You're building the infrastructure for a lot of websites and services, and you've got to make sure that thing is robust and that it never goes down. And so, that would be a key priority when you're building that service. And we could give lots and lots of examples, right? Whether it be a business or or, even a sport, when you're a hockey team building your hockey strategy, or a basketball team building your basketball strategy. I did the hockey thing just for you, by the way.
You're speaking to my heart. You're speaking to my heart.
There you go. So, you've got a strategy on what type of team you're building. And when you're deciding what type of team you're building, you're going to go for speed. You're going to go for, aggressiveness. Then your priorities have to align to what your bet is.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I find that often people just don't take that moment to take a breather and actually think about it and go, okay, what's going to hit the yardstick the longest? And also what is actually in line with the strategy, what we're trying to achieve, what is most aligned with that. Another thing you hit at, and this is something which I find leaders have to spend an inordinate amount of time at, and that is, talking about the vision and talking about the strategy. You pulled out a, unfortunately, not surprising yet staggering statistic there, which was basically said almost no one knows what a company's strategy or organization's strategy actually is. So what are the best ways for leaders out there to go out and get their people, one, knowing, but two, bought in, and then three, kind of like becoming basically, super fans of the company's strategy themselves?
So this depends a lot on the size of your organization. I'll give you an example for a large organization, and then we can talk about a smaller one if you want to as well. So I had a long career at Microsoft. I ran a lot of successful businesses, and I also inherited some businesses that were really messed up and didn't have any strategy. And one of those way back in the day was MSN, which I was in charge of in like 1999. And when I inherited it, it had no strategy. It was an also ran in the web services area, and there was nothing that anybody knew about what the sort of plan was. So first, what I did is I kind of drafted my thoughts on what the strategy is after reviewing the business, and then sat down with my leadership team and talked about what I thought the strategy should be, and got some good feedback and made some, a little bit of alterations. And then in my case, I kind of put all the pieces together, and I actually had a gigantic meeting in the big convention center and presented the strategy to everyone. And I made sure and do it in a super compelling way and that would make people excited about it. And then periodically after the meeting, which went really, really well, I would send updates on how we were doing and how different pieces were fitting together. And that led to people being bought in because they felt like they knew the strategy, they were keeping up to date on the strategy. It was a compelling strategy, and we made huge progress as a result. So I think communicate your own way and in a way that works from you, but it's generally some combination of pitching everyone on what's going on, and then regular updates and information flowing. And then ways for it to go back and forth so you can learn from your people, what am I doing well, what's not going well, what salespeople, for example, give you great feedback on what customers are reacting to in your strategy. So it's really good to sort of keep that information flow. And then often on a regular basis have, every 6 months or so, have a strategy update with your team, and a strategy offsite with your leadership team to revise and make the appropriate adjustments as the market changes.
There's two awesome things in there that I just heard. The first being, leave your ego at the door. And that is allowing your people to come and bring forward their ideas and being able to question, being able to provide feedback and all this stuff, because things have changed now as leaders. Before, back in the day, and I'm talking way back in the day, leaders were looked at the ones who had all the answers. Well, that's not true anymore. Leaders these days are the ones who have to have the questions. And now everything is so diverse. Like, I'm sure we could fill multiple podcast episodes with just your experience at Microsoft and MSN alone about all the, about this. But the thing about all the different specialists and all this stuff, where as a leader, you don't necessarily know everything. You might be know enough to be dangerous, but that's basically about it. So you have to rely on their input and stuff like this.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, great leaders is hired to their weakness, not to their strength, and
exactly.
and fill that in. and great leaders listen and don't preach. And there's I'm sure many podcast episodes you've had where people talk about that, right? And
Absolutely.
It's sort of a fundamental component of successful leadership. And if you're building your strategy, do you think you're going to do it all yourself with no input from your team? That's not a recipe for success.
No. And the second part that I really like there, what you were talking about was, that continuous evaluation. Has the situation changed? And looking at it every 6 months to a year and making those minor tweaks, because it's easier to make those minor adjustments along the route than it is to do a massive pivot at a crucial time. The companies that we see who are flourishing right now during the whole COVID-19 pandemic are those who have made those minor pivots throughout, and now we're set up for success. Whereas the companies who didn't make any minor pivots, who just kind of said, "Oh, status quo, let's keep going," and now suddenly find themselves like, "Holy crap, we're in the hurt locker, and things are still not looking good, and we don't know how we're going to survive." So those are two great things I really got out of that.
Well, so good. I'm glad. In most cases, making minor tweaks works. I mean, if your strategy is completely failing, though, then you have to do a major reset, and that does happen sometimes. If Blockbuster had made the right kind of major reset, they might, be competing with Netflix right now, but they didn't. And we can name numerous examples like that. But most of the time, like you talked about, and I talked about earlier, you can, sort of tweak and revise and remodel, do a small remodel to your strategy. You don't have to rebuild.
No, for sure. So when I say minor tweaks, like Blockbuster could have looked at how the market was changing, what the scope of it, looking at what Netflix was doing, like, oh, can we look at this whole mailing thing? Oh, wait, now things are going more and more online. How do we take advantage of going online by saying, hey, everybody's, people are just going to come to the doors and rent the movie. And if we don't have what they want, too bad. I'm sure they will still grab something else. Well, we know how things went. People got lazy, like, why go to Blockbuster, rent a movie for $5 when for $8 I can sit here on my couch and order it from my satellite TV direct from up here in Canada, Bell. Hello. That's a no-brainer.
Yeah, there's a great story in my book, Strategy First, about a meeting between Netflix and Blockbuster, and where Netflix was pitching that Blockbuster should buy them, and Netflix, went in there and not expecting a lot. And sure enough, Blockbuster was arrogant and not listening, and, basically laughed them out of the room. And now look what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we talked a lot about the execution, but let's move into the M part of it. That's all about the, sorry, how did you put it again? Market
potential.
Market potential, right? So let's dive into the market potential aspect. What should leaders be looking at in terms of strategy and market potential? Because I kind of feel like we kind of went into it a little bit there, talking about this story with Netflix and Blockbuster and using that example anyway.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, again, this kind of relates to your goals, but if you're doing a startup or you're an established business and you want to make a significant amount of money, then you need to have a market that has that potential to provide that to you. Now, maybe you're a family restaurant and you're super happy with a family restaurant and you're making enough money for, to live comfortably. That's great. No problems. But if you have greater ambitions than that, then you have to make sure you pick market potential businesses where you can achieve that. And, there's numerous examples. I mean, I see it all the time in the startup world where someone thinks they have a great idea, and maybe it's a great idea, but the market potential is actually tiny. It's a great idea for a very small number of people. So that's why market potential is really key. When you think about, new businesses, take something like the iPhone, the market potential is gigantic for smartphones. And so as they entered that business, that was something that, basically eventually everybody was going to have gigantic market potential, right? And, in my book, I talk about Geico and what their strategy was and how they developed success in auto insurance, another huge, gigantic market. So, you can pick businesses that are niches and often be very successful in those businesses. But the thing about building a strategy first winning bet, you have to know and think about and be conscious about what your market potential is and make sure it aligns with what you want to achieve.
So this is interesting because we talked a lot about the big businesses out there, but you hinted at like the small business, the mom and pop shop restaurant, whose market potential is not going to be huge, right? Now, I would think that for those businesses out there and any other type of small business, when you consider market potential and then you line your strategy to that, like, okay, we don't necessarily have to, obviously don't put money into R&D because we're a restaurant. Consider aspects like that of their market potential and how much resources they're going to put into these, kind of like development and additional things that they could be doing within their business to elevate it, when the reality is it's just not worth,
Yeah,
just
I
not
mean,
worth it.
yeah, you got to be really focused, especially when you have the limited resources of a small business. For example, take Topper's Jewelers. Topper's Jewelers is a jewelry store in Burlingame, California, outside of the San Francisco area, sort of between San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. And the owner of that business has a very successful store, but decided to sort of grow the business online and with social media a number of years ago. And they sell both jewelry, and they're very, very successful with high-end watches like Omega, for example. And they've done an amazing job becoming experts on watches, especially jewelry as well, beyond the area they are in just Burlingame, California, which is, a nice, sort of wealthy suburb of San Francisco. And that was all a focused sort of strategy of a smaller, what was a smaller business, now growing to a much larger and more successful business, because they focused in the right areas in terms of market potential. How are we going to grow our market? They developed knowledge or developed a reputation around for their knowledge of watches. They sell them at good prices. They have high-end watches. Collectors go to them. Other people just buy nice watches for friends and family, go to them. So you could be an established business like them and grow your market potential that way and think about your strategy that way. You could be a startup and do it that way. You could be a large business. I mean, look what Disney's done to expand their market potential by buying Marvel and buying the Star Wars franchise. And, so acquisitions is another way some people grow their market potential. So market potential, whether you're starting a business, whether you're a business that wants to grow like Topper Jewelers, whether you're a large business like Disney using acquisitions as a tool, market potential is core to building a winning strategy.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And the reality is it makes a lot of sense too. And especially with the examples you use, Disney's a great example, and how they're building and they're expanding, and you see the impact that the leadership team of Disney is having, essentially on the world. Like Disney Plus is a huge success. Their purchase of not just Marvel, but Lucasfilms, the whole Star Wars franchise is now under Disney. So they're really definitely pushing. And the person who I subscribe to for stock advice pushes hard on Disney stock, actually. So shout out to Mike Carew from Dividend Stocks Rocks. There you go, Mike. I'll let you know I actually shouted you out on my podcast. But yeah, he's a huge fan of Disney and their stock, just for all these reasons, that from a leadership perspective, their strategy is aligned, and therefore their financial aspects are moving forward as well with that. So lots of great things in there for people. And I probably just gave some, stock advice for people out there for free.
Yeah, maybe you should throw a disclaimer out there though. Just
yeah. I am not an advisor. Don't take my.
But I don't know how much you want to sort of just riff on this, but the whole streaming market and what's happened over many say 30 years is fascinating. I mean, because 1987 is when the VHS came out, right? And that was a new strategy, right? A new innovation, and change is key to building winning strategies. And so that innovation led to in the independent video store, which then led to Blockbuster, because we talked about that earlier.
Right. And
that was really interesting. And then Blockbuster, people started getting tired of all the late fees, and Reed Hastings, I'm tired of these late fees. And remember the Netflix red envelope, that became a big deal. right? And that peaked in like 2010, I think. But still in 2007, they started doing streaming. Company's not called DVD Flix, it was called Netflix. They recognized there was something new coming that they wanted to take advantage of. And so then they started streaming, and that streaming grew and grew and grew. But then they recognized that as broadband and new technology allowed for more and more streaming, that everybody who they got content from was going to start their own streaming services, like Disney that you just talked about, or Paramount Plus, or Amazon doing streaming, or
Hulu, HBO,
exactly. And the list is like a mile long. So realizing this, Netflix adjusted its strategy and said, we're going to do original content. So around 2013, they started doing original content because that was the way they would make sure they had an ongoing stream of great new content and to keep building their subscribers and their revenue and profit. And so they adjusted their strategy yet again from the red envelope to streaming with original content, right? To take leadership. So, Disney's done very well with their streaming, but even with that, Netflix has continued to be the leader.
No, don't worry, you're preaching to choir. I totally believe Netflix is the leader right now in that area. But that's that highlights the whole last part of your equation, right? The C aspect and the continuous change and evolution of your strategy, and basically having a great foresight of what, one, the technology changes, but two, what the market demand is going to be like. And as leaders, we need to be thinking down the line. Okay, what is it going to look like in 5 years, 10 years from now? It's kind of hard to do that this day and age due to the pace, that change occurs at. For God's sakes, it's like every day something new pops out. But that, as leaders, we need to look at that. And that's a great example that you use with Netflix, because, instead of saying DVD Flix, Netflix is of internet and a reliance on the internet, and seeing that this is actually going to be a huge deal and moving towards that online platform, and being one of the first movers for not just being online, but mobile, and realizing people are going to be consuming this content on their phones while they're doing the train or the subway or the bus to work and all this stuff, because, well, I got 40 minutes to kill, might as well watch my show. So great.
Not to overuse the hockey example, but there's a famous Wayne Gretzky quote, right? I don't remember exactly, but it's something like, I always skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. And that's key to strategy, right?
Absolutely. So we hit all of it. E times MC squared. Where do you find organizations really hiccup? Where leaders hiccup the most when it comes to developing their strategy for their companies, for their organizations out there?
Wow. I mean, I see lots of mistakes people make. I mean, as I mentioned, customer value is the most important part. And we talked about, you reinforced too, all the customer value that Disney's providing with its content, or Tesla provides with its cars, or Apple provides with its iPhones, or Microsoft provides with its cloud platform or Office. That's really core. And I find a lot of companies don't recognize what the real customer value is that they need to have relative to the competition. And that's another thing, is a lack of focus on what is my strategy relative to the competition. So I see that mistake a lot. I see the lack of alignment in companies is a big deal. So I have an exercise I have companies I work with do, and there's a worksheet on my website, bradchase.net, that you can download. It's a very simple worksheet. But in a strategy offsite, have everyone fill it out before the meeting starts. And what you find is, if you take even the leaders in the company, they don't agree on what the strategy is. So if the leaders aren't aligned on what the strategy is, that's a recipe for disaster. So I see lots of mistakes. I would say not understanding what your customer value is relative to competition, not alignment on what the company bet is another one. Poor execution, obviously, we talked about already. There's a long list of mistakes that people make, but also, as you know, given all the successful companies in the world, there's a lot of people who, have really built winning strategies, or sometimes lucked into it. That counts too.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of areas for people to hiccup and trip up and stumble, if not fall flat in their face, right? And you listed them all off, so I don't need to re-go over that. Um, we have a lot of people out there, obviously, who are senior leaders within big organizations, listening, watching, following along. However, there are also an increasing number of people either in small, medium-sized businesses to small businesses, and they may not even have it. They might go, "We don't have a strategy. We just kind of building the plane as we fly it per se. You know what? Maybe it's time we sit down and figure this out. Where should they start? And then, what's your best advice for them outside of obviously either A, buying your book, or B, hiring you as a consultant slash coach?"
I'm always happy when people buy my book, and it will help, but it's not a panacea in and of itself. Look, the model in the book, and what I talk about when I work with companies, all that really helps people be successful. But in the end, it's your own ingenuity, your own creativity, your own smarts that leads to your success. And the best way to start is to be clear about what bets you're making, right? I mean, it's so key to, when you're planning your attack, to know what bets you're making. So what I recommend for a small company or a large company, sit down with your leadership team, fill out the worksheet on my website or something similar, which you can adapt to your company. Make sure you use that as a vehicle to get alignment on where you're at today. And then brainstorm using the tools in the book, and tools from other experts that you respect, to help you build a winning strategy relative to the competition. So think through things like, how can I use maybe change to build a winning strategy, or innovation to build a winning strategy? Think of all the businesses that completely came into fruition because of the web, and built their whole businesses based on that. And the companies that didn't react to that, they're dinosaurs now. So I get together, talk about those things, and think about, can I seek change? Can I mine gaps, which is another tool I talk about in the book. I mean, all the time there are companies who take advantage of holes where people have gaps. For example, I talked about Geico earlier. Another good example of a company that mined a gap. There wasn't a lot of excitement about insurance, and all the companies were basically the same. Geico started building a brand and using humor and lots of advertising. So they mined a gap that people weren't taking advantage of. So there's lots of different ways you can build a winning strategy. I named a few of the sort of advice and tools. There's more in the book, but the way to start is to sit down and make sure you know what your bets you're making and what your strategy is. Go do it, and if it's not working, evaluate and adjust.
I like it. And in the end, something's better than nothing, right? And the final part is evaluate and adjust. Make those pivots, those minor adjustments as you go along. And if you totally find yourself flat in your face, then I'll give Brad a call, right? Brad, no, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's not a topic that I have a ton here on the podcast, i.e. strategy, mainly because with it being peak performance leadership, we kind of go towards that more of the softer skill sets, but at the same time, sometimes we need that more of the managerial aspect of running a business and running an organization. And in my definition of leadership, that is actually one of the three components of leadership is resource management and this kind of falls into that, plus decision making, which is another component. And having a strategy enables you to manage your resources, allocate them appropriately, and make proper decisions going forward. So thanks for coming on. Before we wrap up here, I do got a couple of last questions for you. The first being a question I asked all the guests here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, and that is, according to you, Brad Chase, what makes a great leader?
The thing that makes a great leader is someone who puts strategy first. You will not find a single successful business that doesn't have a winning strategy. Lots of other things are important to leadership. I'm not denying that. But if you don't have a winning strategy, the other stuff doesn't matter. Put strategy first to be a great leader.
That's fair. I would give you. I definitely give you. That's a fair one. That's the new one. Haven't gotten one along that hard along the strategy front before. Out of probably 140 interviews now. So kudos to you for finding one that's relatively new.
Thanks.
But seriously though, if you don't put strategy first and your company fails, you put people on the street without jobs, then who are you leading in the end? Then
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are plenty of companies with great people that they hired, that have a good process, that are inspirational. They're, empathetic leaders. They're creative. They're tenacious, but they made the wrong bet and bet on the wrong strategy. And it doesn't matter. All those things won't matter if the strategy is not right.
Fair. All right, man. Final thing is, how can people find you? How can they follow you? Shameless plugs allowed. Feel free. It's all about you right now.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So of the social media, I just do LinkedIn, and you could find Brad Chase there and follow me there. My website is bradchase.net, and I have lots of tools and great stories. Find out about how Microsoft did a deal with the Rolling Stones, for example, that was very famous in its day. And you can get the book anywhere you want, Amazon or your local independent bookstore. I have a copy here. It's called Strategy First. This is it. I don't know if it looks a little blurry to me. Oh yeah, it's because I have the blur feature on. Anyway, it's Strategy First, and you can get it, wherever you like to get your books.
And for the audience listening, when this is live via the podcast, RSS feeds, you can find it at movingforleadership.com/172. Brad, again, thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening, or thanks for talking. Thanks for the listener for listening. And it's been awesome. Thanks for coming out.
My pleasure, Scott. Great to be here.